Her mother had a binder. That's the moment I understood how far past the point of no return we'd gone. 6 days after the reunion, standing in the Marsh kitchen with a cup of coffee I hadn't asked for, watching a woman I'd met twice in my life open a 3-inch white binder with color-coded tabs and say, "Now Nolan, honey, St. Anne's book's 11 months out, so we really ought to call Monday." 6 days earlier, a woman I hadn't spoken to in 15 years grabbed my sleeve beside a punch bowl and whispered 4 words in my ear. "Pretend we're engaged, please." And I said, "Okay." I've spent a long time trying to explain to myself why. I think I finally understand it. But you have to let me back up. My name is Nolan Vance. I'm 33 years old, and I'm a locksmith in a town called Bellwood, in the same shop my father opened before I was born. Vance and Son, it says on the glass. He painted that himself the year I was born, which is a lot of confidence to put on a window about a baby. I never left Bellwood. My mother got sick when I was 19, and I stayed. She died when I was 22, and by then my father's hands had started going. Arthritis, the cruelest possible disease for a man whose trade lives in his fingertips. And the shop needed somebody. He's 71 now, and still comes in most mornings to sit on the stool by the register and tell me I'm doing it wrong, which I love more than I can say. He taught me one thing above all the rest. The first week he let me touch a pick. "Nolan, anybody can open a locked door. 4 seconds and a crowbar. Any fool alive can do it. That's not the trade." He held up the pick. "The trade is opening a locked thing without damaging it, without breaking one single part. That's what people are actually paying for, son. Patience instead of force. Anybody can break in. It takes a craftsman to be let in." I lived by that sentence for 20 years, and I didn't understand what it meant until the night everything came apart in a room full of people. Here's the thing about being the one who stayed. Everybody leaves Bellwood. That's what Bellwood is for. You grow up here and you get out, and every few years you come back for Christmas or a funeral or a reunion and say, "God, this place hasn't changed," and you leave again. And there's always a guy who's still here, who fixes your mother's deadbolt and remembers your locker combination, and everybody's glad to see him, and nobody has ever once come back for him. That's me. I'm the guy people come home to see. I've never in my life been the reason anybody came home. I'm not bitter about it. I like my work and I love my father. But there's a particular quiet that gets into a man who's spent 15 years being the thing people are glad is still standing where they left it, like a water tower. You start to think of yourself as scenery, and scenery doesn't get chosen. It gets driven past. Before I tell you how a whispered lie at a punch bowl rearranged my entire life, if you believe the person meant for you might be the one you decided long ago was out of your reach, hit that subscribe button, because this channel is full of stories exactly like this one. All right? The reunion. I should tell you about Delaney Marsh first. We were in the same graduating class, and that's about where the similarity ended. Delaney was the one everybody watched. Not just pretty. People forget pretty. She had this way of walking into a room, like the room had been waiting for her. She dated Chase Whitaker, who was exactly what you're picturing. Quarterback shoulders, a father who owned half of Main Street, the easy confidence of a boy who'd never heard the word no and did not expect to start. And I was the kid who cut keys. Delaney Marsh and I existed in the same building for 4 years and probably exchanged 40 words. Except for one night. March of senior year. 11 at night, closing up alone, and somebody knocked on the glass. It was Delaney, standing in the dark in a jacket over pajamas, hair wet from the rain, eyes swollen from crying. I have never been more shocked in my life. Her parents were fighting that year. Everybody sort of knew. Bellwood's small. And Delaney, it turned out, had been getting in her car at night and just driving, for hours, to be anywhere else. That night, she'd come home and realized she'd lost her house key, and she couldn't ring the bell, because ringing the bell at midnight meant her parents would know she'd been gone, and that would start the whole thing up again. And she couldn't, she said, standing in my father's doorway at 17, be the reason they screamed at each other one more time. So she'd driven to the only lit window on Main Street. I didn't say anything comforting. I wouldn't have known how. I went to the wall of blanks, found the right one, and cut her a key on my father's machine. 4 minutes. I filed the burr off the edge with my thumbnail so it wouldn't catch, and I put it in her hand and said the only thing I could think of. Now you can always get in. Nobody has to know. She looked at me a second too long. Then she said thank you and left. And on Monday, she walked past me in the hallway with Chase's arm around her and didn't say a word. I decided that night meant nothing to her. It was the only reasonable conclusion. I filed it away with everything else, and 15 years went by. I almost didn't go to the reunion. My friend Denny has made me do every good thing I've ever done, since we were 9. You've been sitting in that shop since Bush was president, he said. Put on a shirt. So I put on a shirt. The reunion was in the high school gym, which somebody had tried to make look like something other than a gym, and had failed. Chase Whitaker was there, holding court by the trophy case, thicker in the neck and thinner on top, with a wife and a real estate empire, and the same voice that carried further than it needed to. And Delaney Marsh was there, older, not worse, realer. And I noticing is the only skill I have, that people kept approaching her in a certain way. That gentle voice people use on someone they've heard something about. She'd gone to the city and built a design business and been the success story of our year, right up until 2 years ago, when it came apart. At 33, she'd loaded her life into her car and moved back into her childhood bedroom. Bellwood loves nothing on this earth more than a fallen golden girl. I was by the punch bowl. Of course I was. 15 years, and I was still the guy by the punch bowl. And I watched Chase collect a circle around him and wave Delaney over and do the thing. Laney, big smile, hand on her shoulder, just a beat too long. God, it's good to see you back. Back for good, I hear. Living with Ray and Bonnie again? He let that sit for the crowd. And still single, huh? You know, I always told you were too picky. I watched her face. It didn't crumple. It went smooth, which is worse. That's the face of somebody who's been practicing. And she said, actually, I'm engaged. The circle made a noise. Chase's eyebrows went up. Engaged? To who? And Delaney Marsh turned around, looked across 3 feet of gymnasium at the guy by the punch bowl, and her eyes said please so loudly that I heard it. She walked over. She grabbed my sleeve. She put her face next to my ear, and she whispered, pretend we're engaged, please. And I said, okay. I don't know why. The most honest answer is that a woman knocked on my window at 11 o'clock one night, 15 years ago, and asked me for something small, and I gave it to her, and nobody ever had to know. And I suppose some part of me had been standing at that window ever since, waiting for her to knock again. So I put my hand over hers and turned around and said, hey, sorry, I was getting punch. You want punch? You could have heard a pin drop. Chase's whole face reorganized itself. Nolan Vance? He said my name, the way you'd read an ingredient off a package. Then he laughed, and it was the meanest sound in that gym. Laney, come on. The locksmith? You came back to Bellwood and got engaged to the guy who cuts keys? That's right, I said. Uh-huh. He looked at her hands. Where's the ring? I felt her go rigid, because there was no ring, because there was no engagement, because 90 seconds ago, we hadn't spoken in 15 years. We're not doing a ring, Delaney said, thin but steady. You're not doing a ring. No. And she pulled her keyring out of her jacket pocket and held it up. I think purely because it was in her hand, and she needed something to hold up. I've got something better. Chase snorted something about how that tracked. The circle laughed politely. The moment moved on, and everyone drifted off. and Delaney breathed out. But I wasn't listening to any of that, because I'd seen the key ring. There were maybe 6 keys on it. Car key, 2 house keys, a little padlock key, and an old brass one, worn down to a soft gold shine, the teeth rounded off from 15 years of rattling in pockets and purses. The edge of the bow filed smooth in a way I would recognize on my deathbed, because I filed it with my own thumbnail on a rainy night in March when I was 17 years old. I stood there with punch in my hand and my heart going like a hammer, and I told myself no. Every old brass key looks the same after 15 years. And besides, the Marshes had sold the Chestnut House 12 years ago. They'd been on Pearl since. That key didn't open a single door in Bellwood, which meant it opened nothing at all, which meant she was carrying a key to a house that no longer existed. I didn't say a word. What was I going to say? Excuse me, is that the key I cut you when we were children? I told myself I was seeing what I wanted to see. That's a thing a man who's been scenery for 15 years is extremely good at telling himself. The photo went up that night. Somebody took a picture of the 2 of us by the punch bowl, with my hand over hers, posted it, captioned it, "Bellwood's best kept secret." Congrats you 2. Bonnie Marsh saw it at 7:40 the next morning. Delaney called me at 8:15. I've never heard a human being sound like that. "Nolan, my mother is crying. She's been crying for 20 minutes. She's already called my aunt. Tell her the truth," I said. "It's fine. I'll say it was my idea. I'll take it." There was a long silence, and then Delaney Marsh told me the thing that trapped us both. 10 years ago, I was engaged to Chase. Everybody knows that. Her voice was very careful. What people don't talk about is that my parents paid for that wedding. All of it. My mother had a binder. She'd been putting things in it since I was in high school. They spent everything, and 3 weeks out, Chase called it off, and there was no refund, and my dad worked another 6 years before he could retire because of it. I closed my eyes, and my mother has spent 10 years watching me get smaller. First the wedding, then the business, and now I'm 33 in my childhood bedroom, and she looks at me across the table every morning with this ache, like she's sorry, like she thinks it's her fault. Her voice broke, and this morning, she saw a photograph, and she's been crying with joy for 20 minutes, and she got the binder out of the closet. She got the binder out, Nolan, and I have to walk downstairs and tell her it isn't real. I stood in my shop with the phone against my ear. My father was on his stool, pretending not to listen, doing a terrible job of it. "Or," I said, "or what? Or you don't tell her today. You let her have the week. She's had 10 bad years. Give her 7 good days. We can be engaged for 7 days, Delaney. It won't kill anybody. Then we'll have a fight, and I'll be the bad guy, and you'll be the one everybody feels sorry for again. Except this time your mother will have had 1 nice week." I heard how it sounded. "That's all I'm offering. It's the only thing I've got." She was quiet so long, I thought the call had dropped. "You'd let the whole town think I dumped you. They already think you're too good for me," I said. "It's not a long walk." That's how you end up in a kitchen 6 days later, looking at a binder. The week became 2 weeks. 2 became 6. It got away from us the way a fire does. Not all at once, just one thing catching the next. Bonnie called St. Anne's. There was a cake tasting. There was an appointment about flowers I sat through, with my hands on my knees. Ray Marsh, a man of maybe 40 words a year, shook my hand at the kitchen door and held on a half-second too long and said, "You're a good one. She's had a run of bad ones." Then he went out to his garage, and I found out later, he cried out there, and I have never felt like a worse human being. And here's the part nobody warns you about when you agree to fake something. You have to be there. There's a lot of driving to and from things, a lot of waiting rooms, a lot of standing in a parking lot afterward, not quite ready to get in your separate cars. And in all that time, you cannot fake a conversation. A conversation is just a conversation. It doesn't know it's supposed to be pretend. She started coming to the shop, at closing, with coffee, because it was on the way. And then it stopped being on the way and she came anyway. She'd sit on the counter and watch me rekey a cylinder and ask questions nobody's ever asked me. Real ones. Nobody asks a locksmith why he likes it. Because everything else in the world is guessing, I told her one night. People, mostly. But a lock has one answer. There's exactly one way it opens, and if you're patient and you don't force it, you'll find it. Every time. I set the pick down. It's the only honest thing I've ever met. She looked at me a second too long, the way she had at 17. She told me about the city on those nights. The real version. How the business hadn't failed, it had been taken, quietly, over 18 months, by a partner she'd trusted, and how she'd been so busy being embarrassed, she'd never told her parents the whole truth. How she hadn't designed anything in 2 years. How some mornings, she woke up under a ceiling she'd stared at as a teenager and couldn't tell what year it was. And I told her the thing I'd never said out loud to anyone. I'm the guy people come home to see, I said. Every reunion, every Christmas. Everybody's glad the shop's still here. Everybody's glad I'm still here, like a landmark. I've never been the reason anybody came home. I shrugged. It's not tragic. It's just true. She was quiet a long moment. Then she said, very quietly, Nolan. And something in the way she said it made me look up. And I saw her keys on the counter. The brass one, gold and worn, sitting right there. Can I ask you something? I said. That key, the old brass one, what does it open? Delaney's hand moved. Fast, not rough, but fast. And closed over the ring and swept it into her pocket. Nothing, she said. It's just an old key. Her voice cracked on old. I didn't push. That's the whole trade. You don't force a thing that's not ready. You'll damage it, and then it never works right again. But I stood in my father's shop that night after she left, and I thought about a brass key with the burr filed off by a thumbnail, and I did not sleep. Chase blew it up at the engagement party. Bonnie threw it in the backyard on Pearl, the first week of June. 60 people, folding tables, her good tablecloths, a banner. Chase came because Chase's mother and Bonnie have been in the same church circle for 40 years, and because a man like that does not miss an opportunity. And I watched him work the yard all evening with a beer in his hand and something patient behind his eyes. He waited until Ray finished a toast, 40 words, the most I'd ever heard him say at once, raising his glass to his daughter and saying he'd waited a long time to see her happy, and he'd take it however late it came. And into the applause, Chase Whitaker said, loud and warm and reasonable, Ray, before you get too far into it, you should probably know there's no engagement. The yard went silent. He didn't shout. That's the thing. He was gentle about it, and he'd done his homework. Reunion sign-in sheet, he said, holding up his phone. Delaney Marsh, +0. Attending alone, 6 weeks ago. Swipe. And a text she sent Marcy Deacon 2 days before. Dreading Saturday. Everyone's going to look at me like I'm a cautionary tale. He put the phone away. All sympathy. She stood at that punch bowl. I asked her a simple question, and she panicked and grabbed the nearest man in the room. The locksmith. And they've been lying to you, to her own parents, every day since. Bonnie, you booked a church. He shook his head like it pained him. I'm not trying to ruin a party. I just don't think a family should be conned in their own backyard. Every word of that was true. That's what I want you to understand. He didn't invent one thing. He just took the truth and stripped off everything that made it human. 6 weeks of a daughter who couldn't bear to break her mother's heart, of a man who'd offered her 7 days, of 2 people who'd gotten lost inside a kindness. He took all of that out, and what was left was con artists. I watched it hit the yard. I watched 60 faces change, I watched Bonnie Marsh's hand go to her mouth, and I watched Ray put his glass down very slowly on the table. Delaney didn't move. She'd gone smooth again, practiced, and I heard my father in my ear, clear as if he'd been standing beside me. Anybody can break a door down. 4 seconds and a crowbar. Any fool alive can do it. You're right, I said. The yard turned to me. Every word of that is true, Chase. I wasn't loud. I've never been loud. And you've been sitting on it how long? 2 weeks? 3? Waiting for a toast, so it'd land on her father. I set my glass down. You're not protecting this family. You're protecting a story. The one where you called off a wedding 10 years ago, and she never got up again. That's a very comfortable story, and you've told it to yourself for a decade. And then you walk into a gym, and there she is, engaged to the guy who cuts keys, and the story stops working. I looked at him. You didn't come here for the truth. You came because she looked happy, and you couldn't stand it. Chase's mouth opened, and that's when Delaney said, "Nolan." I turned. She'd taken the keyring out of her pocket. "He's right that we lied," she said. "Not to me, to the whole yard, to her mother. 6 weeks ago I panicked at a punch bowl, and I made it up. And Nolan said yes, because he's the kindest person I've ever known. And I let it go on, because I couldn't watch you put the binder away, Mom. That's true. All of it's true." Bonnie made a small sound. "But Chase left out the part he doesn't know," Delaney said. She held up the ring, and she pulled the brass key out from the rest, and she held it up between 2 fingers, where everyone could see, and she looked at me. "This doesn't open anything," she said. "It hasn't opened anything in 12 years. It's the key to the house on Chestnut, and you sold that house when I was 21, and I've carried it every day since I was 17 years old." I couldn't breathe. "When I was 17, you two were having a hard year." She looked at her parents. "And I used to leave. At night. I'd drive for hours because I couldn't stand to be in the house. And one night in March I lost my key, and I couldn't ring the bell, because ringing the bell meant you'd know I'd been gone, and I couldn't be the reason you started up again." Bonnie was crying. Ray had gone gray. So I drove to the only lit window on Main Street. And there was a 17-year-old boy closing up his father's shop, and he didn't ask me one single question. He just cut me a key. Took him 4 minutes. He filed the edge smooth with his thumb so it wouldn't catch, and he handed it to me and said, "Now you can always get in. Nobody has to know." She turned the key in the light, and then I went to school on Monday and walked right past him, because I was Chase Whitaker's girlfriend, and he was the boy who cut keys, and I was 17, and a coward. And I have thought about him every year of my life since. The yard was so quiet, I could hear the neighbor's sprinkler. "I didn't grab the nearest man at that reunion," Delaney said. "I saw the attendee list 2 weeks before. I saw his name. That's the only reason I went. I got in the car dreading every person in that gym except one. And when Chase asked if I was still single, her voice broke all the way. Out of every lie in the world, I reached for the one I actually wanted. She looked at me. Just me. It was never pretend, Nolan. Not for 6 weeks. Not for 15 years. And you never once asked me why I kept it. Because you're the only person alive who's ever been careful with me." She wiped her face with the back of her hand. "I'm sorry I lied to everybody. I'd do it again." Nobody said anything for a long moment. Then Ray Marsh, 40 words a year, Ray Marsh, turned to Chase Whitaker and said, "Get out of my yard." Chase got out. Nothing changed overnight. That's how I knew it was real. She didn't fall into my arms. There was no kiss in front of 60 people. Everyone went home extremely awkwardly, and I drove back to my apartment above the shop and sat on the edge of my bed at 2 in the morning, still in my good shirt, trying to make my hands stop shaking. She called the next day. "Can we start over, properly? I don't want to be engaged to you. I want to be asked out by you. I want the whole thing in order and slow, and I want to earn every part of it after what I did to my mother." So I asked her out, like a normal man, on a Thursday. At 1 month, her coffee mug was in my cabinet, and neither of us mentioned it. At 2 months, I cleared the back storeroom and built her a drafting table out of an old door, because she'd said once, in passing, that the light back there was the best she'd seen in 2 years. She sat down at it and cried, and then she designed something for the first time in 26 months. At 4 months, my father started calling her kid, which is the highest honor he confers on anyone, and she started coming in Saturdays to sit with him, while he told her I was doing it wrong. At 6 months, she landed her first client from that drafting table, and signed the contract herself, alone, having read every line. At a year, I asked her to marry me. In the shop, at closing, no audience and no speech. We'd both had quite enough of an audience. I gave her a key, brass, cut by hand on my father's machine, the same one. He won't let me replace it. I filed the burr off the edge with my thumbnail, and I set it in her palm and closed her fingers around it. That's for the house on Ridge, the blue one. I put the offer in 6 weeks ago. It's ours if you want it. My voice wasn't working right. You've been carrying a key to a house that doesn't exist for 15 years, Delaney. I'd like to give you one to a house that does. She didn't say yes for a while. She couldn't. Bonnie Marsh got her binder out of the closet for the 3rd time in her life, and this time we used it. St. Anne's, 11 months out. Delaney wore her mother's dress with her own alterations. Ray gave a toast that ran to almost 100 words and had to stop twice. Denny told the entire church about the punch bowl. My father sat in the front row with his ruined hands folded, and when they said the part about rings, Delaney held up her hand and the whole church laughed, because everyone knew by then that she wears the old brass one on a chain around her neck, the key to a house that isn't there anymore. She's never taken it off. I think about that gym a lot. About 4 whispered words, and the 15 years I spent certain that one rainy night in March had meant nothing at all to her. My father spent his life teaching me that anybody can break a door down in 4 seconds, that the whole trade is opening a locked thing gently, without damaging one single part of it. Patience instead of force. Anybody can break in. It takes a craftsman to be let in. I was good at that for other people. 20 years, every door in this town. I just never believed it applied to me. I was the water tower, the scenery, the guy people were glad was still standing where they'd left him. I decided a long time ago that I was a man nobody would ever come home for. And I locked that door myself, from the inside, and stood behind it for 15 years calling it realism. And the whole time, she was walking around with my key in her pocket, waiting for me to notice the door was never locked at all. If you've ever carried something for someone for years and never told them, a key, a photograph, a sentence you never said out loud, I want to hear about it, because I don't believe for a second I'm the only one. Tell me down in the comments, and tell me where in the world you're watching from tonight, because I read every single one, and it astonishes me how far these stories travel. Someone wrote in last week from a night shift on the other side of the planet, just to say they'd kept a letter for 11 years, and I haven't stopped thinking about it since. And be honest with me before you go. If someone had grabbed your sleeve at that punch bowl and whispered, "Pretend we're engaged," would you have said okay, like I did? Or stepped back, done the sensible thing, and let them face that room alone? There's no wrong answer. There's only the one you'd have to live with. If this story got to you even a little, do me one kindness. Tap that like button so it finds the next person who needs it tonight. Hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell, because I'm here every week with a brand new story about the kind of love that was standing right there the whole time, waiting for somebody to finally look. Stay a while. I'm glad you're here.